did you buzz for me, Mr. Googans?
I doubt very much if it was a mosquito you heard. Of course I buzzed for you. Take a letter.
Oh, wait till I get my notebook.
Of all the slow on the uptake people, what's taking her so long? Miss LeBourne!
Oh, here I am. I had too sharpen my pencil.
This is to Mr. John Hooper, Consolidated Cookie Company, address on this correspondence, dear sir.
Did you say John Hooper?
Yes, dear sir. Regarding your letter of the 15th, at the moment the prospect of filling your order seems quite remote. However, we can supply...
Did you say Consolidated Cookie Company?
Say, what have you got down there? Read back what you've written.
Mr. John Hooper.
Well, go on.
Mr. John Hooper. That's what I've got down here.
Do you mean I've been talking into thin air?
Well, I just wanted to be sure I had the correct name.
That's all in the back correspondence I told you. You're the most bird-brained, backward, stupid, dumb excuse for a stenographer.
And you, Mr. Googans, you are very redundant. So there.
Speaking of redundancy, it would seem that I'd be falling in line behind that gentleman, I suppose, if I were to say that on this excursion in science we're going traveling. But we are. You see, this is to be an excursion in excursioning, under the proxy guidance of a seasoned globetrotter. The globetrotter is Geoffrey M. Tate, of the Archbold Expeditions of the American Museum of Natural History. Our proxy guide will be our science reporter, Emerson Markham, for he got the facts for our discussion from Mr. Tate. And he's here right now, pawing the ground.
Why, thank you very much, Bob Stone, and how do you do, everyone? Mr. Tate said he'd been asked frequently why they go sometimes to unpleasant places and deliberately choose to live in discomfort. So he told me some of the contributions made by exploration to our victory in the war.
Emerson, before you go any further, will you explain the relationship between the Archbold Expeditions and the American Museum of Natural History?
Well, Bob, the Archbold Expeditions, of which Mr. Tate is a staff member, is an organization financed and headed by Mr. Richard Archbold and affiliated with the American Museum. The Archbold Expeditions and the specimens you see on exhibit, but during the last few years, the need for secrecy prevented the publication of a lot of interesting facts.
So now it can be told?
Well, partly at least, Bob. You know that the museum sends scientists to all parts of the world. Consequently, there is a lot of information stored up which cannot be put in showcases.
Well, yes, but what did the Archbold Expeditions contribute towards our victory?
Their men have collected in the Arctic, in Burma, in New Guinea, throughout the Pacific Islands, to mention only theaters of war. They experimented with foods and clothing suitable to such places and eliminated the undesirable and the unsatisfactory. They made maps of localities which were generally unknown and unpronounceable until the fortunes of war turned them from unhousehold names.
In other words, they really knew the country in which our armies would have to fight.
Yes, and they knew to what extent the soldiers could live on the land, and they were familiar with the types of vegetation, geological formations, and mineral deposits in strange parts of the world. They were able to give advice on the natural hazards in the form of insect and other animal life which our troops would encounter. In matters less active in the military sense, but just as vital to the winning of the war, our scientists were sent afar in search of new sources of rubber, for example, and for other things of which we were deprived by enemy action. On all these things, they were able to give, and they did give, expert advice to the government, gained through personal and sometimes painful knowledge acquired during the pursuit of their normal peacetime lives.
I know you've been giving us background information so we could really appreciate the work of the expedition, Emerson, but didn't Mr. Tate get more specific and give you examples of what they did in their travels and where they went?
I was just coming to something of that sort, Bob. But first I want to mention that these expeditions involve the expenditure of thousands of dollars and months of preparation before the personnel can even leave their home country. To give you some idea of what all this means, I'll tell you what Mr. Tate told me about their 1938 expedition.
Where did they go?
To Dutch New Guinea, Bob. This naturally was arranged with the government of the Dutch Indies. Dutch scientists accompanied the Archbold men, and a Dutch military covering party was supplied. Dayaks were imported from Borneo to act as porters, and of course the American part of the personnel included specialists in many subjects. A radio station had to be constructed as the field parties were to keep constant radio communication with the base. A landing ramp for the Archbold flying boat had to be built so that the ship could be hauled onto dry land for inspection and repair if necessary. Living quarters, workshops, and warehouses all had to be set up for the accommodation of the personnel and the huge quantity of stores which was required. All these things had to be done before the expedition could start from the United States.
Well, I don't want to appear impatient, but let's start on this expedition too, Emerson, huh?
Well, when the go signal was finally received, Mr. Archbold and the crew of his Catalina-type PBY-2 flying boat, named the Gooba, set out from San Diego and crossed the Pacific, stopping at Honolulu and Wake Island. And then the actual exploration of the interior began.
Incidentally, Emerson, why the military escort?
Well, this was unknown country, and you never can tell. Dutch policy then did not permit unescorted parties in the interior of New Guinea. And perhaps, too, the Dutch had an idea that a closer knowledge of their part of the island might be useful a little later. Anyway, there they were, and mighty valuable to the cause of scientific exploration they proved to be, according to Mr. Tate. We can't go into details here of the results and the discoveries of the expedition, but their aerial photographs, their maps, and their collections gave to the world a vast amount of knowledge of a little-known expanse of country, and to our allies and ourselves, tactical and invaluable information regarding a future theater of war. That is one of the results of scientific exploration, you see.
Well, how about some examples of other results, Emerson?
Well, of all the things Mr. Tate talked about, probably one story of the results of their explanation or exploration would be most interesting. It's about that part of New Guinea which later, under tragic circumstances, became known as Shangri-La, or the Hidden Valley.
Well, I remember hearing about that, too, during the war. Were the Archbold fellas there, too?
Yes. In June of 1938, the crew of the Gooba, while on a reconnaissance flight to the Snow Mountains, sighted a valley about 500 or 600 square miles in area, which showed every sign of a high form of agriculture. To investigate it, they sent 2 patrols overland over rugged mountains and through dense, wet forests from the field camps.
And what did they discover in the valley?
Well, they discovered a native population of perhaps 50,000 persons, never before seen. And the Archbold scientific party moved in and stayed for several months in that valley, living in peace with the natives, a tribe named Persegam or Pesegam. The men were initiated into the tribe by a blood-sprinkling rite.
Well, not very civilized sounding, to say the least.
The blood was that of pigs, which were subsequently eaten at a weird feast and dance, Bob. The Pesegam, who had no knowledge of metals and did all their tilling and cultivating with sharpened sticks, had developed an intensive form of agriculture, drained their lands, grew crops of sweet potatoes, their staple food, and tobacco, bananas, a kind of spinach, and cucumbers. Their only domestic animal was the pig, except for a few dogs.
Well, what did the people themselves look like, did Mr. Tate say?
Oh, yes, Bob. Their clothing was nil, though some wore headdresses of animal skins or string hairnets decorated with feathers. Their jewelry consisted of pieces of shell hung around their necks and sometimes a boar's tusk forced through the pierced septum of the nose. Apparently, they were monogamous, and the men slept apart from the women in small round huts. The women had long rectangular huts, by the way. There were uncounted numbers of villages in the valley, each with a wooden stockade or a stone wall, and their gardens were fenced to keep the pigs out. There seemed to be no central authority in the valley, and various groups of people fought among themselves, but with 1 or 2 exceptions, they were friendly to the Archbold men. When the expedition left, more pigs were earmarked for consumption on their return.
And did they go back?
Well, no. The next visit by white people was fated to be in May of 1945, when an Army plane crashed into the valley, killing all of its passengers, save 3. That story has been ably told by WWII Corporal Margaret Hastings, one of the 3 survivors. However, as a result of the 1938 Archbold expedition, they were able to place in the hands of the Army Air Forces maps and recommendations for rescue operations based on knowledge gained in that very valley. The Gooba, their flying boat, had made 13 landings on the Balam River, which flows through the valley, and it may be that the amicable relations established by the Archbold party created a feeling of friendliness toward the survivors of the crash. Those are some other beneficial results of scientific exploration.
Well, they didn't go on any expeditions during the war, did they, Emerson?
Well, no, Bob, there couldn't be any then. Mr. Tate said that their men were either in the armed forces or were engaged in scientific research on military subjects. At the time I was talking to Mr. Tate, their plans were indefinite. There is still much of New Guinea which is unknown, and there may be more lost tribes and other hidden valleys. If they do go again, and they hope to, Mr. Tate says that they'll be able to use the knowledge they've already gained to help them to deeper penetrations and a greater knowledge of this world of ours.
Thanks to you, Emerson, and to Mr. Tate, we wind up this excursion in science much better acquainted with expeditions and what they stand for. And ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to have a copy of a paper prepared by Geoffrey M. Tate of the Archbold Expeditions of the American Museum of Natural History, all you have to do is address your requests to Excursions in Science in care of the station to which you are now listening, asking for scientific paper number 229, entitled Scientific Exploration and War. That's Scientific Exploration and War, scientific paper number 229. It will be placed in the mail for you free of charge. And now, lo and behold, it's question and answer time. For the uninitiated, it might be well to mention that the questions which you're about to hear have been sent in by you listeners. The answers reflect the most reliable and up-to-date information on the various subjects, since they are based on facts provided by staff members of the General Electric Research Laboratory or of other equally trustworthy institutions. Well, there's nothing to be gained by delaying any further. Let's get at these inquiries. Here's the first one, Emerson. It comes from one of our friends in Sanford, North Carolina, who writes, in traveling from a given point A to a given point B over the same road and under the same conditions, does a man do more work while walking or pedaling on a bicycle? And why? He says the problem came up recently in a physics class.
In traveling from one point to another over the same road under the same conditions, you would do more work walking, because on a bicycle, much of your weight is carried by the bicycle. Our friend has no doubt had the experience of walking over a level road which he had cycled, and has found that traveling on that level road, say 20 miles long, on a bicycle is much less tiring than traveling an equal distance on foot.
Well, next we have a letter from a lady who says, I have a large African violet plant. Several small slips have grown from the base of the plant. I would like to know how it is possible to separate them so as to start new plants. Or, if this is impossible, how are new plants started?
She can divide the plant by breaking off the small slips that have started to grow, Bob. If roots have already been formed on them, all she needs to do is to pot them. However, if they have no roots, set the slips in a dish of water so that just the base of the slip is resting on the surface of the water. The rest of the stem and leaves should not be immersed.
Then when roots appear, they can be potted, I suppose?
Right, Bob.
Okay, next we have this one. It comes from a young man who says he has been arguing with a friend about a problem of distances. Now, this is the problem. A man starts out exactly at the North Pole, walks 5 miles due south, then 5 miles due east. How far is he from the North Pole? Our friend says 5 miles, basing this conclusion on his belief that distance east and west is measured along a parallel. He wants to know if he's correct.
Yes, Bob, he is. If you start from the North Pole and walk 5 miles due south and then 5 miles due east, keeping in an easterly direction all the time, you would still be 5 miles from the pole. Our correspondent is correct in saying that east and west are measured along a parallel of latitude. Of course, the path after you turned east would not be a straight line, but that of a circle 10 miles in diameter. If you walk in a straight line, even though you start in an easterly direction, you would walk in a southeasterly direction.
Okay for that one, Emerson. Next we come to this letter. It comes from a physics student who asks if light waves obey the laws of refraction when they enter a gas not as dense as air.
Light is refracted in going from air to a gas not as dense as air, Bob. The direction of refraction is the same as going from glass to air. The amount of refraction is exceedingly small because whereas glass has a refraction index of about 1.5, air has an index of 1 29/100,000. The gas that is less dense than air would have a still lower index.
A listener in Pittsfield, Massachusetts inquires, if you were flying a kite and were to let go the string, would it come down?
Well, probably most varieties of kites would become unstable when the string is loosened, but there might possibly be some stable types of kites which would stay up.
Here's an interesting question, Emerson. The young lady asks, what effect would intense heat have on an inflammable substance sealed in a vacuum?
When the temperature becomes high enough, organic substances, even in a vacuum, will decompose. This is called pyrolysis. It represents actual breaking down of chemical bonds, and in general, simpler organic substances are produced. Production of good-grade gasoline from low-grade gasoline is done in this way and is called cracking.
And to prevent our friend in the control room from cracking under the strain of getting us off on time, I'd better say thank you, Emerson Markham, and goodbye, everyone, until our next excursion in science.